Is there a widespread crisis of personal meaning and identity today? And what can we do about it today? On The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Dr. Paul Vitz. He's a Catholic husband, father, and grandfather, a psychologist, scholar, and retired professor. He's the author of many books, including his most recent Analog Hunger in a Digital World, Confronting Today's Identity Crisis. Dr. Paul Vitz, welcome back to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a great pleasure to be able to discuss your recent book here, Analog Hunger in a Digital World. And right away in the dedication of this book caught my attention. It reads as follows: "This book is dedicated to my wife and family through the many, many years during which I brought up the topic of analog and digital. They wisely suggested many ideas and patiently endured the topic when it no longer really interested them. Many thanks." So I know the book is recent, but how long have you been thinking about this topic of analog hunger in a digital world, and why do you think it has resonated with you for so long?
Well, I think, first of all, I began thinking about this about 1975. So whatever years back that goes, about 50, I think. So it's been on my mind for a long time. And I, from the beginning, saw it as related to the two different brain hemispheres. And that's been given a lot of recent attention by a British scholar named Ian Gilchrist. But in any case, we talked about it at the table a lot, and my family sometimes got a little bit tired of it. But they were very helpful along the way and very patient.
Yes, well, yeah, you're seeing something here that is important. We want to see it too. And yeah, reading the book, you certainly share many of the insights there. We're going to try to get to as many of the most important ones as we can during the show today. But you begin chapter 1 by kind of laying down the terms here. You state, human beings have only two basic ways of representing information: knowledge, understanding, and meaning. One is with analog codes, the other with digital codes. What are these analog and digital codes?
First of all, the digital code is usually made up of numbers. It can be other symbols, but a digital code is a code that has no connection, no physical similarities to what it refers to. It's an arbitrary set of signs that have been arbitrarily defined as relating to something. In other words, there's nothing physical that's similar between the code and its reference when it's digital. Is that clear?
Yeah, it is. And so analog...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And analog codes are the codes that are similar to what it is that it refers to. And the most basic one is our sensory perceptions. I see a picture of you and I know who you are. That picture is an image created in my brain by my visual system. And I see you, or I see other things, or I hear things. In other words, the sensory world is created by our system, our interior system of neurons and organs and so forth. But it is close to what it refers to, or at least similar. So a code that's analog always has some analogy, some similarity to what it's referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, very, very helpful. And one of the important points you make here is to say that the two kinds of code each provides unique information or knowledge that the other cannot provide. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, you talk about there being a continuum. In fact, you have a chapter here, the analog to digital continuum and the analog to digital progression. What do we need to understand there?
Well, over time, when we make a representation of something, I mean, when I look at you, I see you. But if you give me a picture of you, a photograph, that's also analog. But it's not as complete as my original perception. And as time goes on, I might take Jim Havens and say, well, I'll sketch him a little bit. I'll show you a photograph, and then I'll have a sketch of you. and eventually I'll just have a stick diagram that refers to you. So a symbol for each of a person can become more or less analog as time goes on. And historically, most of our symbols that were analog to begin with have become increasingly less so, and some eventually become entirely digital. So the movement is from analog to digital, never the other way around as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the examples I think that you give are very, very helpful, and the historical context. You write here about how society went from a primarily an analog existence to a much more digital life in the movement of Western society, going from primarily oral culture to now one dominated by written text. You say the printing press moved human understanding of the word from something oral, that is sounded or spoken, to something visual, silent, and much more abstract. And the slow but truly major shift from oral culture to written culture, which is an example writ large on human history of the progression from analog to digital code. So I think this starts to help us understand what we're getting at here. Anything else you want to say to this, or applying it, I guess, to anything else of our time that we can look at it and really make sure we're understanding what we're talking about here?
One thing is money. Originally when we had trade, we would have barter. I'd give you a chicken for a bushel of wheat or something like that. And then eventually we invented money, which was coins usually. Originally it was all physical, made out of gold or silver or bronze. And then after a while we invented paper representations of that. Those were letters of credit. And then we started issuing letters of credit called, dollar bills and $10 bills and so on. And now we've gone to completely digital money for most of us. It's just the numbers on our credit card, and they go into a system of numbers. We have no physical record. They're now they now even want to get rid of currency and have an entirely digital code for money. So it's gone from an analog, a barter, or at least using gold or silver currencies, or at least paper money. It's now gone to completely a set of numbers that are electronic. And that's a good example of going from analog to digital in the world of money. We've done similar things in other areas.
Yes, very, very interesting. We're talking with Dr. Paul Vitz about his recent book, Analog Hunger in a Digital World, Confronting Today's Identity Crisis. And so, you start to unpack as we go kind of the pros and cons, certainly many of the dangers and the bad consequences of the digital world that we find ourselves in today, and this analog hunger that goes along with it. We're going to get into a lot on this topic here today. But let's see, what can you share with us? This is an important aspect of it. You mentioned it in the beginning, how the analog and digital codes relate to the two brain hemispheres.
Well, in essence, the left hemisphere is primarily a digital hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is primarily an analog hemisphere.
And why does that matter? Why is that helpful for us to understand?
Well, it allows us to understand that, the McGilchrist distinction requires that you know about neuroscience and the brain and so forth. Analog and digital is something that you can observe in the world in front of you without having to think about your brain, knowing, and now you don't have to be a brain scientist. You can look at something in front of you, know it's either analog or digital. Or if it's analog, you can know whether it's very analog or slightly analog or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. And I remember as I was reading it, it caught my attention that that anger kept showing up on one particular side. Is that of importance to us? Does that help us to understand anything that would be good for us to keep in mind about, I guess, the emotion of anger and how it's interacting in the brain?
Let me put it this way. Digital systems are entirely coherent within them, and they are based upon your certain presuppositions, but within those presuppositions, digital systems are completely coherent. And the person who is pushing a digital concept or a system knows that it's completely coherent within it, you will not think about the presuppositions very much, which have to be true and often are not. But when you attack somebody, criticize somebody who has a digital understanding of something, they get very angry right away and consider you just stupid because you don't understand the logic of the system.
Interesting.
But
And so,
there are other forms of anger, of course.
right. So that's very interesting, though. And then on the other side, more of the analog, the right side, this would be less, I guess, dogmatic, more freewheeling. How would you describe it?
It's more open because the world of perception is almost always open to new alternatives. And you're always moving around and you don't, as you see something, you don't know what you'll see next. And so it's much more certain about things. It's much more open and free-flowing with the analog experience.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Paul Vitz is with us. So this is fascinating, this first segment, just kind of getting the terrain down here. Wait till you see where we're going to go with this and how this really plays out. We're going to see it in many practical examples that you're going to notice, you're going to be familiar with, but then what does it mean? Where do we go with that? Very interesting topic today. We're going to be right back with Dr. Paul Vitz. Stay tuned.
iCatholic Mobile is a proud sponsor of the Station of the Cross. Solid connections, reliable data. That's iCatholic Mobile, a 5G wireless provider dedicated to your faith and values. Enjoy unlimited talk and text, dependable coverage nationwide. And every plan has unlimited data and free roaming in Canada and Mexico. iCatholic Mobile, the service that connects you to what matters most. More info at iCatholicMobile.com.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Paul Vitz, our guest today. We're going to get back to the topic at hand in just a moment. But first, do you know that iCatholic Mobile is the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today? If you already have cell phone service, you could switch it over to iCatholic Mobile, and then you'd be getting your cell service from a Catholic source that you can feel good about. But also, iCatholic Mobile gives a portion of every dollar earned to the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network, which means when you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you are helping to fund all the programs on the Station of the Cross, including The Simple Truth. We greatly appreciate you considering iCatholic Mobile. You can check them out today at iCatholicMobile.com. Back to our topic, analog hunger in a digital world with Dr. Paul Vitz. You write here that the development of our present culture has been a systematic process of growing left hemisphere dominance, which is the digital side, especially since the end of the medieval period, and that today the modern West has become so left hemisphere dominated that this dominance is the source of our current cultural malaise. Can you unpack this some? Because I guess initially I would kind of think, in thinking about this, my initial thought would go to just the sense that we've lost so much of our morals. We've lost so much about objective truth, so much relativism and all of this that we're kind of too open. But that would be the right hemisphere dominated. But you're saying we're going left hemisphere dominated here, and we have been for some time. Can you explain that to us?
Well, yes. Let me put it this way. Our identity used to be based upon very clear analog activities in our life. One would know who one was by, let's say, what you worked at. And most people had a job that would be consistently the same all their life. They would be a farmer, there might be a butcher, there might be a carpenter, there might be a housewife, they might be a secretary or what have you. But most of our jobs were relatively stable and they were part of your life. And the jobs were part of our analog life and they gave us an identity. Same is true about our families. Our families tended to be stable and live in one part of the country. The Smiths might live in Maine and the Joneses might live in Louisiana. And in those two places, you got an identity partly from being in Louisiana and being a swamp person, so to speak, or being a Maine Yankee or whatever. So you got an identity from the analog life of where you live, what you worked at, And from family stability, you knew you were the oldest child or you were the youngest one. You knew you had a mother and a father and so forth. You knew you had a crazy aunt and maybe a very funny uncle, but you knew your family with a certain degree of constancy and stability. And we got our identity from that. We got our identity from our language, from our culture, from our nation, and from our religion, as well as from our work and from our family situation and where we grew up. These were all based upon analog life. Mm-hmm. But okay. Now those basic forms of identity have become diluted.
Okay, yes, yeah.
We now have to be ready to have 2 or 3 different jobs in life. You can't even sign up for General Motors and be that kind of a person for all your life. You have to be able to move back and forth from different jobs to different jobs. You no longer live in the physical world outside. Somebody could be a child in Louisiana now and another one in Maine, and they could have their life would be in common because it was all on the internet playing games. It would neither one of them be a Yankee or a swamp person. And so that has happened over and over again, so that people now, particularly the young people, don't get into the physical world with their body that much. In other words, they don't engage. They can be just involved in this digital world on the cell phone, just dealing with cell games, dealing with things of that kind where they don't even know their physical body. And when they don't know their physical body, they're open to the possibility, particularly because of what happens on this when you're looking for identity on the digital end. You're very open to transsexualism. And what a transsexual person is someone who has lost track of what their body really is about. And probably, if you lose track of what your body can do, you don't go hiking, you don't go doing these things with your physical body. You don't learn what you are physically as a man, as a woman, as a boy, as a girl. You don't learn all the things that come from that. And not having even interpersonal interactions that are stable any longer. You don't learn what it is to become a good friend. You don't learn to have a membership with one gang of boys or with one cluster of girls and so forth. So the result is that the basic forms of human identity are increasingly diluted. And that opens us up to not being sure what our sex is. And that makes us not being sure what we're all about in any sense. We've lost a clarity of identity, and that's the identity crisis today. It's a lack of meaning, people complaining about no meaning in life, and so on. Meaning is directly connected to analog experience. And when you have digital, the digital is always fundamentally arbitrary. Well, how you write, each language has a different way of writing the same word. They're arbitrary. They may even be pronounced the same, but they have a different visual language, and it's arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is great. Dr. Paul Vitz is with us, and very important stuff. It gets very interesting very quickly here as you're talking about this sense that we've lost our sense of being grounded. A person's identity in the past, you write, and what it used to be grounded in is now often dissolved, and so we've lost this sense of being rooted in a particular place, context, or the practice of faith, of religion. And so you see the terrible consequences of this. And this is what you're beginning to share with us here. You do write about these things in the book and quite extensively. And you say how, there is this hunger then, this lack of identity leads to many ways of expressing what you're calling here analog hunger. So even if we're in the digital world, people have lost this rootedness, this groundedness, they're still hungering, though, for the analog, for the real, and that's going to come out in some ways. And what you're saying is that's what we're seeing with transgenderism, that's what we're seeing in various things. And also note how in many of these instances, the person has made physical changes to their body making up up their own identity however they see fit. You write one thing in the book about images of these trans species humans. You say they're available online. Look them up and be amazed. I did take your encouragement there. I looked them up, and wow, I was quite surprised by what I found. People who have taken the identity of various animals and believe that that's their identity, and then they start to physically change their appearance, go with extreme surgeries and all kinds of things to try to look like that animal that they're saying they now identify with. So you're saying this is all a really consequence of this digital world and this analog hunger, even to the point where you say the young people today who are actively cutting themselves are also using pain as an analog experience that gives meaning. Anything else you want to say on this?
Well, I think you did a very good job of summarizing what the problem is. I'm not saying that all digitalism is wrong or bad. It's just that as we get more digital, everything becomes arbitrary as to what we're going to do with it. And so we lose meaning as it becomes more and more digital, it becomes more and more arbitrary and less intrinsic meaning. So what we have to do is find some kind of identity that is going to hold up no matter what. And that's our search right now. And I suggest an answer to that.
Yes, we're going to get to those answers, those suggested answers that you give us. Some great stuff here in terms of solutions. But one last thing, I guess, on the symptom that we see oftentimes, and it is helpful to see this. I think this piece of writing is very helpful to see, and very interesting. You write, contemporary gays have a flag and have parades in much the same way that previous ethnic identities did, like the Irish or Italians. And of course, what used to be our male or female sex is now up for grabs with different genders and various terminologies. In a modest way, the popularity of tattoos can be seen as a way of getting a visible analog identity. So all of these possible symptoms that we see, that various identities that are being crafted and then the body is being changed, or there's this outward expression to try to express this new made-up identity. But this gets very, very problematic, even more so than what we see in these areas when it does come to young people. And you write extensively on this in the book, The Crisis of the Young. What do you want to share with especially parents who are listening that may not be that clued into any of this? What do you want to say about the crisis for the young?
Well, I would say this, that it's important to keep the digital material, shall we say, out of their hands when they're very young, and under a certain degree of discipline when they get into their teenage years. For example, if you go to summer camp, you're supposed to learn how to camp. You know, you go hiking, you build fires, you may set up a tent and so forth. But many people, if they go on their camping trip or their summer that way, they'll take their cell phone with them and they'll spend the whole time talking to people on the cell phone and won't pay any attention to what the normal summer camp would be. And this is a failure of getting involved with the analog life that you're supposed to be learning about. And so you have to find a way to keep digitalism from coming in too soon with your child, in some way to not allow to keep it monitored and keep it low when they're young. In addition, it's always helpful to have them learn something that involves their body. We may be too involved in sports, but at least the kids who are involved in sports are learning what their body can do and so forth. So that's helpful. Maybe they're learning a musical instrument. That's fine too. But to have them involved with the meaning that comes from their natural body interacting with something natural or at least beautiful and good, such as music or perhaps painting. I don't know, many of the arts would work. But
yes,
avoid having them on that cell phone all the time early. Some people feel that if they lose the cell phone, they've lost their self.
Wow, yeah, isn't that interesting? And so, you can kind of see we're starting to get into the solution or the suggested solutions here, and that's going to be good to unpack with Dr. Paul Vitz when we get back. But a little bit more on what he writes about the crisis for the young. He says the absence of strong analog experiences is especially damaging to the young. The older generation, using the new digital media, know who they are and welcome the convenience of digital media, but the young who begin their lives without a basic immersion in analog life are very vulnerable. Goes on to say cell phones, video games, the internet all drastically reduce contact with the varied external world. As a consequence, these children have a weak and limited sense of their body and its relationship to physical reality. These young individuals literally don't know who they are interpersonally. Young persons who spend more time with digital media than the experience of physical reality don't know what their body can do or how their body relates to the physical world. In short, they are without a body-based identity. We're going to get to more and get to those suggested solutions when we get back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Paul Vitz discussing his recent book, Analog Hunger in a Digital World. You can get it wherever you find books, and want to get to the suggested solutions here, but we are kind of skipping over a bit in the book to get there. Just want to make mention of it. He's got great stuff in here on the negative effects of digital media, cell phones, negative effects of digital TikTok, virtual reality, illusion with its basic negative effects, and then also quite a nice chapter here on transhumanism, the ultimate digital imperialism. Especially if you don't know much about transhumanism, this is a great chapter to dive into. And also, as he gets into the link between transhumanism and Gnosticism, lots of great stuff here. But then we get into the solutions, recovering analog life and personal identity and meaning. Dr. Vitz, before we get there, anything else you want to say? Anything on the transhumanism or anything else before we get to those solutions?
Well, I would like to mention that transhumanism is, I think, the form of extreme digitalism. And what the point of digitalism is to eventually get rid of the body. It's to make everything, you see, they're putting everything into a digital code. Everything that they can do that they would call a person in a digital code. And in doing that, they're getting rid of the human body. I guess I would say this, we are embodied. And as Christians, embodiment is a very important issue. Supposedly, Satan couldn't bear the fact that human beings had a body. Angels don't have one. And that's why there could never be, for an angel, you couldn't have a son or a daughter. You didn't have a body. So our embodiment is a very important part of what God made us. And transhumanism is aimed at getting rid of the body through a digitalization of everything. So finally, we'd be entirely beam me up, Scotty, as a form of digital code, but we would not have a body. And as such, we would not actually be human anymore. However much there might be something there. It wouldn't be human because we're human because we have a body, and that's what we were made with to begin with. And transhumanism is a movement aimed at getting rid of the body by digitalizing everything. So that's why I brought that up.
Yes, yeah, no, it's a very important topic, and we're seeing it, the beginnings of it in our time, which is why it's important to be talking about this, especially as you get into where this, many of these folks want to go. You mentioned in the book about Ray Kurzweil, who is a futurist, a transhumanist, and to him, to hear when you listen to him talk about it, this is all very normal to him, that this is the way things would go, and then he talks about where it goes, which is this concept of singularity, where there's no distinguishing. Once you hit a certain point, there's no distinguishing anymore between what is human and what is the machine, and that you can't even comprehend what that world is going to be like when it comes. But he predicts that it's going to be coming, I think within like the next 10 years is the way he looks at it. So hopefully that's not going to be the case. We need to get a grasp of this. But one thing that I think is interesting is what you mentioned earlier too, about even we can get us, we're even in it already in a way when, like you said, when we lose, if one loses their cell phone, they can feel like they've lost themselves or a part of themselves. And that really is actually the argument that I've heard Ray Kurzweil say about why not just put a microchip in the brain, which we know is being developed by various folks, Elon Musk working on Neuralink and all of this, and they want to get it going. They'll start that with humans because of these benevolent ideas of helping paraplegics and all of this. But Ray Kurzweil was, his sense of it is to just say, well, I don't want to lose my phone. So why can't I just implant my phone in my brain and then problem solved? And that's the way he looks at it. So we've lost some objective principles, some grounding principles here that are not giving any limits. I guess anything in terms of a solution for what is the obvious solution to making sure that we don't go down that road? How can we speak to the more intellectual transhumanists and give them a simple something to say, this is something that we cannot cross?
It's going to be very hard to do that. I would put it this way: as long as the digital is in the service of the analog and not in the service of itself, that's a general principle. It's not always easy to understand how that might be used, but in the past, if the digital gives a certain kind of helpfulness to us, that's fine. I'm not saying we should get rid of printed material, for example, or get rid of mathematics, which are entirely digital. They've been used by us in a way that's been very helpful. But the point is, they now want to get rid of us, so to speak, in terms of the body itself. And that's the digital in the service of the digital. But whether we can actually solve this problem is another issue.
Okay.
Sometimes I think the only way it could be solved is by some sort of asteroid hit that knocked out all electrical capacities, and we then rebuilt with more sense than we have in the past.
Well, I think one possible smaller way is to write a great book like you've written here, which is going to be, I think, very helpful to many people to wrap their minds around this and to be able to talk about this. We need to start talking about this and getting people to understand what it is we are talking about. Again, Dr. Paul Vitz is with us. His book, Analog Hunger in a Digital World. And so you say in one chapter, the answer, no extremes. We need both analog and digital. And then also in the chapter, Recovering Analog Life and Personal Identity and Meaning, you really get to it here when you're talking about returning to the real. How can you help us? What's the wisdom here? What's the advice that you have for us to return to the real?
Well, in fact, a fair number of people have already been doing this. They're returning to, let's say, the land. They're returning to making things with their hands. They're returning to doing things that they might not have done before. They're returning to, let's say, using tools to make things. You become a carpenter. You do things with your hand. You do cooking. You do whatever. There are a lot of things you can do, and that will give you real meaning. And they are returning to the real and to the way things were done in the past, but not necessarily just because in the past they might have been needed, but you do them now because they are gratifying to you, to make things with your hands, to actually relate to real people, to talk to actual children and to hold them in your arms rather than just see pictures of them or hear about them via your internet. So returning to real people, to real places, and to real activities is the essence of it. And some people have already been talking about that for some time, or proposing the need to return to working with our hands. And many people have discovered it intuitively. So I'm arguing that those things are very important for identity, for keeping us informed with the reality that comes from bodily contact with what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very, very, very helpful and very wise and quite simple, right? Get back to what is real. But at the same time, as you say, no extremes. We need both analog and digital. And then you write a chapter, How Analog and Digital Integration Can Occur. Speak to us about this, about the integration. What does that look like between analog and digital?
Well, as I said, both the two codes contain information that's different. The analog code shows you the image of something, and you can code an image into digital form, but you cannot, when it's in digital form, know what it is. It has to come back out on a screen in a picture again before you can know what it was. So if it's a picture of your grandmother, you know who it is when you look at the picture, and you know when you look at her. But when that picture is put in digital form, you could say, well, it's now digital. Yes, it is, but you can't apprehend it when it's in digital form. It has to come back out on a screen somewhere for you to recognize that it's your grandmother or anybody else. So in that case, the two are helping each other. You're sending the digital message to another place where it may be useful, but it has to come back out as analog again for us to be able to use it.
Mm-hmm. And so taking that principle, what are the best practices that you have found in your own life, I guess, in the practical? How do you play this out? Since you've been thinking about this a long time, I'm sure you have come up with quite a few practices of your own to integrate both the analog and the digital. What else can you share with us?
Family life is very analog, as long as it's natural family life. And it's very important because you learn all sorts of things that you don't even know that you're learning. You're learning how to recognize emotions and intentions. You're learning how to be able to respond to them in other people and in yourself. You're learning, but it's real people that you're interacting with in real environments, and not always in the best environments. Sometimes in very limited environments, or sometimes in very unpleasant environments. But that's how you learn what it is to be a person and to be, if you will, part of a family and part of and part of a culture and part of of what it is to be really a human, is to interact with other people. In other words, we are interpersonal in much of our foundation. And it reminds me, some people say they're, the self-made man. There's no such thing as a self-made man. All you have to do is ask the person who changed his diapers. If he hadn't had his diapers changed, he wouldn't be in existence. He hadn't been fed and looked after for many years by other people. He's not self-made. Problem with the self-made man is he usually worships his creator, namely himself. Namely himself. But anyway, that's another issue.
Yes. Well, and you also do hit on, some deeper aspects of things when you talk about faith and how that plays out here with all of this. You say the case for mature religion. So what is this case for mature religion that you make here?
Well, I use the term mature religion to refer to religion that has gone through the fires of the criticism that modernity has provided. And it has burned away aspects of religion that were unnecessary and often superstitious. So a mature religion, and there are only 3 mature religions that I know. They are Judaism, Protestantism, and Catholicism. We'll call that Christianity and Judaism. Most of them have gone through the fire of modernity. Not entirely, but they've more or less come out without anything that's too ridiculous that you would call as part of them anymore. And religion, the thing about religion, at least Christianity, is it is always a combination, and Judaism too, an integration of what we would call analog and digital. The digital is represented by Scripture, which is found in all 3 of them. And in philosophy and theology, in the writings, there's plenty of digital there. But we always have analog in our religion. And I think you can imagine what that would be. For the Jews, it was always some interaction with God that was physical, crossing the Red Sea, and what have you. There were many other ways as well in which God showed up as a physicality. Mm-hmm. In Christianity, we have plenty of analog. We'll get to that time in 4 minutes from this.
Sure.
Great.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to hit the break here and be back with Dr. Paul Vitz. But yeah, it doesn't get much more real than, and the Word was made flesh, right, and dwelt among us. And so, look, and this really gets to our true identity. All right, and this is why God comes to us in this way, why Jesus has come to us, to really say, come follow me, and then to draw us into baptism, that we would be incorporated into him, that we would then be made sons and daughters of the Father for all eternity. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Paul Vitz, psychologist, scholar, retired professor, author, and we're talking about his most recent book, Analog Hunger in a Digital World, Confronting Today's Identity Crisis. You can get it wherever you find books. Dr. Vitz, please continue on. You were talking about Christianity before the break.
Right. Let me put it this way. The body is very important to Christianity in the sense that the Word was made flesh. Jesus came to us as part of our fleshiness, if you will, as a human in a human body, and he came through the body of Our Lady. So the bodiliness of human beings is emphasized both by the birth of Jesus, as developed through the body of Our Lady, and to the fact that Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. So bodiliness is part of who we are intrinsically, is part of what God has made us for, and is part of what he has come to visit us with in the name of when Jesus came here. And so when the Word was made flesh, what you had was the digital was made analog. And another way of saying that the way in which digital and analog work together is that lots of major creativity involves a concept, a digital concept being made concrete in its application. Science is that, where you have a mathematical formula that you can then make contact with actual observable physical reality. So there, the abstract was made capable of touching the reality of observation. Ideas in music and in many other areas are examples of where the abstract, which was more digital, was made analog. And by putting the two in cooperation with each other, you have the best form of integration, and you have, in a certain sense, a basic understanding of what creativity is. It's always the taking of an abstraction and connecting it in a direct and clear way to the real. And that's, of course, what Jesus did in taking the Word, showing us what it was like, and bringing it into the flesh. Mm-hmm. And so I would argue then that the best cooperation of analog and digital is where the digital is made into something that contacts the analog.
And isn't that what we see in the sacramental life as well in the Catholic Church, right? Is that Jesus continues to meet us in the sacraments in a bodily way, so that they all have a sense of an interpersonal relation, or of a touch, or of the various things that are taking place in the senses. And you write at one point, you share some very interesting thoughts about the Holy Mass, and about how it kind of starts off more digital with the liturgy of the Word, and how the ancient texts really are a form of the digital in a sense. And then, but then when we move into the liturgy of the Eucharist, then we really get very much into the analog. Anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I would say that that's the case, that we have a digital beginning and an analog ending. And what the meaning of the analog ending is, which is where we receive the Eucharist, where we kneel, that is the ultimate form of meaning. And that's where, in that sense, because of Jesus' presence in a physical form, all of a sudden the Word is made into our flesh. The Word is something we can touch in the form of the host, touch and taste, and that is an ultimate expression again of the Word becoming flesh. in that case, become our flesh. And that, therefore, the essence of the cooperation between analog and digital is always this: the analog, in the digital in the service of the analog. Jesus was in the service of humanity. He came to serve us, to free us from sin and to serve us. He did not come to be served. And so over and over again, when you see something digital, if it is giving to us something that is filled with meaning or supporting meaning, then yes. But if it's the digital in the service of the digital, it's moving us toward just the arbitrariness of the transhuman ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. And even how when we receive our Lord in the Holy Eucharist, it is us consuming the sacred host. However, it's really in that exchange, he is really consuming us. He is really, as you say, taking flesh in us, and then we are to go out with him from there. Just so beautiful. And this really is the high point of who we are and what we're made for, in terms of really getting to our deepest identity in this life that we're called to be incorporated into Jesus. And then in him, we become sons of the Father, temples of the Holy Spirit, and we are actually sharing the very life of God in this way. And this grounds us and roots us in a way that nothing else can, and certainly does away with a lot of the terrible consequences that we've talked about if one is really engaged, grounded, rooted there. Anything else you want to say on that?
Well, I'd say the saints never had an identity crisis. And the thing is, if you can find your identity in God, you have your identity, it's solid. And it will be, everyone's identity will be somewhat different. You're not going to be following you're not going to be the typical college professor, the typical pro athlete, the typical politician, the typical whatever. You're going to be the unique person that you were made to be. And you will have an identity that will be deeply, deeply satisfying and very good for others as well. So our identity crisis is finally resolved through finding our identity through God. And so in a way, in the past, sometimes we found our identity, as I said, through, where you were born, what family, what country, what language, and all of that. And perhaps this got in the way of finding our identity in God. So maybe one of the reasons that our identity is getting called into question is that God wants us to begin looking for the real source of identity, which isn't even our job. It isn't even, our physicality exactly in terms of whether we're an athlete or not. Our real identity is in God. And when we find that, we will be happy and at peace with our own notion of who we are. And everyone will be rather different. The saints are the one group of people I don't see anything in common across them. They're all varied. We're not like professors who have certain similarities. We're not like radio announcers who have certain similarities. They're not like athletes or housewives or anybody with certain similarities because of their job or whatever. No, the saints are all unique. All of us are called to be unique because each of us is unique. And God has a plan for us. So that's the identity we have to find. And then we don't need to worry about trying to become an animal. We're going into some sort of transhuman existence or something like that.
Yes, yeah, and that is the way that we find our real uniqueness as a person is when we come alive in the grace of God. There's no other way to really know it fully. As I think it's Saint Irenaeus that says, "The glory of God is man fully alive," and this is the vision that we're called to. And I love that line. The saints. They didn't have an identity crisis. I would say, and I think you presume this, but before their conversion, many of them did, right? But it's after the conversion, right? And so just to say, if you're out there, if you're not home in the Catholic Church, come on home. come find the treasure that you're made for. That hunger in you is for a reason. Come on home to the Catholic faith and find it. Dr. Vitz, it's always a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for being on with us today.
It's been great to be with you, Jim. God bless everyone out there. And find your identity in our Lord.
Yes, yeah. Again, the book, Analog Hunger in a Digital World, Confronting Today's Identity Crisis. Get it wherever you find books. I think you're going to find it very illuminating. God bless you all.